Welcome to the Commercial Real Estate Show, your source for insightful analysis and enlightening discussions. Hello, I'm Michael Bull. Thanks for joining us on one of the 42 radio stations, iTunes, YouTube, and the show website, CREshow.com. Well, today we have a very interesting and valuable show for you. We're going to discuss successful environmental strategies. You know, this can be good for anyone related to commercial real estate. I don't care if you're a small investor investing $5,000 through crowdfunding in a commercial real estate deal, or if you're a large developer. And of course, if you're any type of vendor to the business, appraiser, architect, broker, lender, knowing about environmental issues can be very key to both save money, make money, and keep you out of environmental hot water. We have an incredible panel here today. Please welcome Robert Bronner. He's owner of One Consulting Group, an environmental consultant, engineer, right?
Yeah, and Michael, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Appreciate you being here. And Ron Wallace. Ron Wallace is program manager of underground storage tanks with Georgia Environmental Protection Agency. Ron, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Also, please welcome Patrick Putman. He's managing director with the Private Bank. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Glad to be here.
Putman, Mr. Putman. We got you here. All right. And we're going to get into some deep environmental issues and some kind of winning strategies and some mistakes to avoid. But first, if we could start with quickly some basics. So when you're buying commercial real estate property, or in some cases leasing, you want to do some quick environmental studies to see what you're buying. So people are pretty familiar with a phase one environmental audit. What do you do? How long does it take? What's the range of the cost?
Sure. An environmental phase one, it's defined by the ASTM standard, so it's got a defined scope of work a consultant has to do on a piece of commercial real estate. And we go out and do detective work and site visits and interviews, and we determine if that piece of property has been impacted with hazardous substances or petroleum products. And again, the thought there is to see if the collateral is impaired in any way that a lender would not want to lend money on it, maybe taking on liability of an environmental cleanup, or the environmental conditions at hand may decrease the property value and change how the deal is underwritten.
Okay, so you're doing a site visit, right?
That's
so
right.
You're looking around, you're checking records, you're checking history of uses.
That's exactly right.
You're checking online sources and all kinds of EPD places, right? But you're not actually doing any testing.
No, phase one, there's no requirement for testing in that standard. Yeah. You just identify potential recognized environmental conditions that have the potential to impact the property with petroleum hydrocarbons or hazardous substances. And phase ones don't test for asbestos, lead-based paint, or mold issues within a building envelope. Those are non-scope items that would have to be specifically engaged for us to do that during due diligence.
Okay, and I guess a lot of purchasers do have you do those as well, right?
Indeed. Okay. You know, if a developer is trying to demolish a very large building to put in apartments, he wants to know what his asbestos abatement budget is going to be within his demolition.
Okay. Typical cost and time frame?
Time frame is 2 to 3 weeks, and then the costs range with properties, but if you've got a half-acre property in the Greenbelt, you're looking at plus or minus $1,500, and then the costs scale from there. A large industrial site, maybe in the Midwest or the Northeast, where there's a long history of environmental issues associated with the neighborhood, you could be $5,000, $10,000, $15,000. It can scale from there depending on the history of that area.
Okay, so let's say I plan on getting a loan on my property from a big bank, and then later I decide the private bank has a better deal. Can I use that initial environmental audit for whatever bank I'm going to?
Yes, as the user of the report, if you, the buyer, engaged a consultant to perform that report, it's just like an appraisal. It's got a 12-month shelf life, can be updated within an 18-month period typically, and can transfer to whoever the lender would be on the deal, as long as we write a reliance language and comply, Pat. With
Typically, we're comfortable with along the lines of Robert's outline, 12 to 18 months, sometimes 24, depending on the property type. And really, if there was nothing terribly concerning found, particularly in the property history, we generally want it recertified to us as the bank that's going to make the loan.
Okay, but you need to know, I guess, who it is and approve who prepared it, right?
Well, correct, absolutely.
'Cause if I did it for you,
we might be less confident. Absolutely. The difference between environmental and real estate appraisals, the FDIC has very extensive and detailed rules on how appraisals are ordered and managed. There's a little bit more flexibility on the environmental side, and so generally, if we're comfortable with the environmental firm that prepared it, even if it was originally intended for another lender and it gets recertified to us, we're typically comfortable with that.
And Ron, is there anything about phase ones that you get questions about?
Not very often. Mostly we see the phase twos, I'm sure we're going to talk about next.
Yeah.
But phase ones sometimes are sent to us, but and we may evaluate them, but because there's no sampling, no groundwater soil sampling, we really don't spend much time on phase ones.
All right, so phase one shows there was a service station in its past use, or one next door, or some issue. Then comes phase two, right?
Yes. Yes. What you do is the consultant then determines a suitable testing scope based on a budget and risk tolerance to either test around maybe the tanks associated with the service station if it was on site, or test the perimeter of the property if you're adjacent to a former service station. And then once we do that analysis, we would put together a report that's typically reviewed or stamped by a groundwater professional. And at that point, Ron, the regulations allow him to review that documentation.
That's correct. The main thing we like to see when we do get a phase two is obviously that it has been stamped in most states by a professional geologist or professional engineer. They take enough samples, not necessarily on the perimeter also, but we like to see enough samples around the tank pit, around the dispenser islands, typically like groundwater samples, because a lot of these properties, they're vacant. It may be very old. We don't even know where the tanks were. So we rely more on groundwater samples than soil samples because of that.
I see. And as a lender that gets to phase two, you're like, oh, you're backing off? Or
On a marginal deal, that might be enough to push you off. Robert and I worked on a deal a couple of years ago. Suburban office park, probably 50 years ago, was a farm. Drive by, look at it. Everything looks like a nice, shiny suburban office park. Did the phase one, indicated that I think it was a battery manufacturer, sort of uphill.
Right.
And so again, felt good about the property, felt good about the borrower, but a little concerned about maybe their former neighbors. And so we did step up to a phase two, got a number of test drilling done, and we're able to determine that there had not been an impact. So we were comfortable proceeding. Really, I'd say what we ran into on that was a little more time, a little more money.
Yep. Yeah.
And what if I do an environmental audit? I may say I do a phase one and a phase two, and then I decide not to buy the property. And the next buyer comes along and I just hand them to him. Can he use those? Can his lender use those?
Transferable. From a contract and insurance standpoint, the next person to use the reports would have to be engaged in a contractual agreement with my company for me to be able to provide the errors and omissions and professional liability insurance on those reports. So it depends. If I have a really good client that I'm doing a lot of projects with, we're doing a lot of work, I'm really comfortable with them, the next buyer is someone I'd like to develop a relationship with, or just want to progress a deal, I can just issue a reliance letter to that unrelated party to me that I didn't do the work for, and they can use the reports. It really, you kind of have to feel it out.
How's the lender look at that?
Again, a lot of flexibility, a lot of it driven back to the firm. I mean, if we're comfortable with the firm that did it and they did it for you, we're going to be confident that the quality of work that they've did would transfer to us. And we would want the reliance letter so that we could rely on the errors and omissions. We would not just take it and stick it in the file.
That's right.
And what are the typical phase two testing that you end up having to do, Rob?
Your basic commercial groundwater screen is 3 soil borings in a triangle pattern around whatever condition you identify. Old tanks, maybe an old dry cleaner, maybe where they were recovering lead out of batteries and cracking those. And you started the groundwater table because if that's impacted, there's something above it, right? So that's a screening tool. So if you get 3 clean groundwater samples on a property next door to a gas station, you're usually pretty sure there's no impact, right?
Typical price range for that?
Plus or minus $4,500 for what is called a commercial groundwater screen.
In time frame?
You can get them done as quickly as 2 to 3 days if the utilities clear quickly, but a good time period is 2 to 3 weeks to get a final report out from.
Did I mention more time and more money?
Yeah, exactly.
And what about dry cleaners? What do you test in there if you see there was a previous dry cleaner there?
You're doing volatile organic compounds and mainly the chlorinated solvents that dry cleaner would use to clean your clothes, right? We at first when we were starting to find all these contaminated dry cleaners, we were saying, don't use perc, right? It's it's bad for the environment. Well, all of a sudden, all the stuff people were using to clean clothing that wasn't perc had dirty clothes. So people have stuck. Now they're going back to perc because it cleans things, the best of all the stuff we've used.
Yeah, and dirty clothes don't work because I go and try to get a loan with the private bank with dirty clothes. Guy, you can't even take care of your clothes, Mike.
It raises all
That's
sorts
right.
of questions.
That's right. Bring around the collar.
Well, stay tuned. We'll have more on environmental issues. This is the Commercial Real Estate Show. We'll be right back. The Commercial Real Estate Show is brought to you in part by your friends at Bull Realty. When your business requires proven performance, visit bullrealty.com or call 800-408-BULL. Welcome back to the Commercial Real Estate Show. I'm Michael Bull, your host. Today we're talking about successful environmental strategies. We have Robert Bronner here, Ron Wallace, and Patrick Putman. And guys, when we have a problem with a phase 2 or there's some issues coming up, and then we get into dealing with the regulators, right? So how is the communication with the regulators handled? So if I'm buying this property and now it's got some issues, we need to see if it's reported. How bad is it? How is that communication handled?
Well, the consultant would, assemble a formalized report that falls within a regulatory framework of how it can be reviewed, and then we would pass it off to Ron to take a look at it and issue a ruling, typically some type of letter report. Not ruling, but
ruling. This is how it's going
Right.
to be.
Right. Yeah, we would use. I'm in the underground storage tank program, so I would use our guidance documents and the regulations as to. Is it okay? Is it a no further action? Do we need additional work? Do we need additional samples? And review it that way.
Mm-hmm. And it goes back to risk-based guidance. So let's say your former gas station property has a drinking water well on property. Well, it's going to be regulated more stringently than if it didn't have a drinking water source on property, or maybe a surface water body that could be impacted by the problem or the gasoline that's leaking into the water table.
Yeah, one thing I ask more and more, because we do see a lot of phase 2s right now, and one of the things we ask very commonly is, it's not unusual even on old gas stations, the tanks have been gone for years, that you will find some levels of contamination still. So that's one of the first questions I ask. Do a water well survey and surface water survey so we know what the risks are if there's no drinking water wells nearby or surface water nearby that we don't think will be impacted. We may be able to give a no further action. So that's usually outside the typical scope of a phase 2, but more and more now the consultants, at least in our area, know that if they have contamination, this is something we're going to ask first thing.
So you're seeing more testing, you said. Is that more testing? Why are you seeing more testing, do you think?
Just the economy's better. A lot of people are going after properties that have been sitting there idle for years now. Typical gas stations are on busy corners that somebody wants to redevelop. So
we see that from the lender's perspective. Certainly, in-town properties have increased in desirability, and so certainly properties that certainly over the last several years were more challenging would not have been of interest, and now they are.
Yeah,
right.
And I guess one thing we're seeing is even some conservative buyers, they're paying, in some cases, some pretty low cap rates and high prices. So they're maybe a little more conservative in doing more testing, right?
Right. Especially when you're repurposing a property from an industrial use to a residential use, or maybe from a commercial use to maybe a daycare or something. There's trigger points to a deal you need to pay attention to, and I think there's real opportunity for commercial real estate owners when they look at these projects that maybe have gotten denied or weren't worked through a bank or a lending program. If you now look back at them and see if they have these triggers, drinking water receptor, child receptor in the area, and they don't, well, all of a sudden now they become an opportunity, right? Because they've been this property that maybe the brokers have said, oh, no one's ever going to touch that. It's glowing like Chernobyl,
Yeah.
you know, well, maybe it's not. Why don't you take another look and see what caused the problem to happen in the first place? Don't take it at face value.
Yeah. And Ron, what are some of the questions that you get from the buying public about these regulations? And
Oh, we
these
hear
things?
everything. One of the things in our program, the responsible party is the tank owner, not necessarily the property owner. So we get a lot of property owners, am I liable? And we'll say, no, not necessarily. That if you weren't the tank owner, it's the tank owner that has to do the cleanup. And that's one thing we warn investors is that if there's no tanks there, you can't be the tank owner. Now, you may buy the property, develop it, and then let's say 5 years later you get tired of it and want to sell it. Well, if there's still contamination, you may not be able to sell that property. EPD may not be after you because you're not tank owner, but the lender may say, gee, you got contamination still, even though you're not liable. The bank may say, I don't want to give you a new loan or let somebody else buy this. So that's something we get a lot of questions on. Anything on having, how many samples we need to take. I've had some phase twos come in where they do 1 or 2 soil samples and maybe 1 groundwater. I said, your property's too big for that few number of samples. You need to do more investigation so we really can have an idea, especially on old properties where all you're using is old insurance maps, Sanborn maps to say where the tanks were when you just can't even have any idea where they were. So.
Yeah. And I've been in commercial real estate for, I just call it over 30 years now. Quit counting at that point. But I remember back in the day that somebody would say, oh, you've got an environmental issue. Boy, everybody just walked away, it was
Sure.
done, right?
Oh,
right.
yeah.
But now there can be some opportunities, right? And because a lot of these environmental issues can be managed, right? So if you've got less buyer competition because, maybe there was some perk there 5 years ago or some other contamination, there's ways to manage that, right?
That's right, and I think the guys that are really taking advantage of those opportunities are seeing Urban Core, blighted property. They're putting together a good team. They're putting together a group of professionals that understand the story. It's a lender that understands how to manage the environmental issues. Has been to maybe a regulator meeting or two, or met a regulator, talked to one. It's an appraiser that understands the brownfield tax credit and how the cleanup costs can be recovered. It's your attorney who understands the brownfield laws and allows you to buy that property with very limited liability. And it's a consultant that does enough sampling to give you a good liability protection per whatever program we try and run that property through.
Right. Yeah. And we
The
work,
dream team is
yeah.
what that
And we
sounds
actually
like.
work. Yeah, and we work very closely with our brownfields program when it comes to UST sites. So we work hand in hand as to. And a lot of times we'll sit with developers and say, let me see your footprint of what you're planning to build so we know where the contaminants, we can come in afterwards after you develop your property, and then let's do the investigation and any environmental cleanup that we need.
Yeah.
Right, and there's some interesting tools out there that weren't available 10 years ago, in that now you're able to parcel off contamination, whereas before, if the tax parcel was contaminated, the whole thing was contaminated, right? Well, now we can kind of parcel off the danger zones or the areas with risk, and then have a developable piece of property that doesn't give the lender the heebie-jeebies at all, and then that's what they use for collateral, and then and the deal progresses.
And I think another thing is really the intended resale of the property. So something to be repurposed for residential, and you're going to end up needing another buyer at the other end. That's probably going to be held to a higher standard, either carving it out, as Robert mentioned, or cleaning the property up, as opposed to an industrial property that is going to continue to be an industrial and used for manufacturing or other industrial needs. Probably less of a standard. And then from there, it's the ongoing monitoring and the future cleanup expenses need to get built into the future cost structure of the property.
And as a lender, do you ever require environmental insurance?
We certainly would like that when it's available, when the consultant has done the work to deliver it. Certainly the Holy Grail was the no further action, but the inability to get one does not necessarily mean that all parties should walk away.
Right, and the environmental insurers, they want to see testing. They're insuring a risk, and when you give them an open-ended, I don't know what could be happening, your environmental insurance gets really expensive or it's prohibitive. And then if we've done a solid soil and groundwater assessment of an old industrial site, the environmental insurers get a little more interested in doing an insurance policy because they can put a box around the risk at that point.
Yeah. And quickly, what is something that you've seen people insure a risk and really benefit from doing it that way?
I saw an old fire station that had an underground storage tank leak with some oil sitting on the water table that was going to take a while to clean up. but we were able to define how large the plume was. It didn't impact neighbors, and we were able to put a cost figure on what it was going to take to clean it up. And a policy was issued for a 7-year period on that cleanup window, and it allowed a transaction to progress.
Oh, excellent. Well, stay tuned. We'll have more on successful environmental strategies. I'm Michael Bull. This is the Commercial Real Estate Show. We'll be right back.
The Commercial Real Estate Show is brought to you in part by RealNex, providing a comprehensive suite of powerful commercial real estate tools at an incredibly low cost. Visit realnex.com. That's REALNEX.
Welcome back to the Commercial Real Estate Show. I'm Michael Bull. Today we're talking about successful environmental strategies. My guests are Robert Bronner, Ron Wallace, and Patrick Putman. And guys, one of the things that seems to be coming up now is air quality. And it seems to be more important to all of us, the air we breathe and the water we drink, right? Is air quality the new asbestos? Asbestos, people used to be really afraid of asbestos, 20, 30 years ago?
Right.
Now
Sure.
it seems to not be as big a deal. It's not around as much, too. So what about air quality?
Well, I think from a risk assessment perspective, vapor intrusion is what it's called, and it's when there's been a release of volatile compounds or chemicals to the subsurface of a site that readily vaporize and get into the breathing air of maybe a retail lease bay that was formerly a dry cleaner. And those regulations have just been published and certified, so they're official. And we're all, I think the regulators and the consultants, we're all figuring out how we're going to manage that issue within, how we do commercial real estate.
Right. Yeah, in our program, vapor intrusion has not been looked at very closely as when we issue a no further action letter. It usually doesn't come into play. We're really looking at the soil and groundwater issues and not so much the vapors. But the good thing, well, there's two good things about when it comes to vapor intrusion. One is that when it comes to petroleum, it's not that big of a problem. Of the over 10,000 releases we've had in our program, only a handful, maybe less than 1% have ever had a vapor intrusion issue. And typically when you do have a vapor intrusion issue, it's where you have really high groundwater contamination, very shallow water, or you have actually free product where gasoline's on top of the water. So if you remediate that, get rid of it, knock out the dissolves in the free product, the vapors will go away. Typically the vapors get into the utility trenches and utility lines and get into buildings. When it is an issue, it's a very serious issue, and we've had some in our program, but we haven't had any formal guidelines as to how we deal with it on a case-by-case basis.
Right.
Well, it's good to know what vapor intrusion is, because I thought it was when the guy in the cube came back from lunch and he went to a Mexican restaurant. I thought that, vapor intrusion. Well, so what should I do then if let's say I'm buying a building and I'm going to have my employees in it? Should I do more due diligence than the normal phase one, or did I only do more vapor intrusion testing if there's phase 2 issues?
I think it depends on the concern.
Okay.
If you're worried about maybe an old battery manufacturer where it's lead and acidic solutions that don't create a vapor concern, it's something you don't.
Right.
It's been addressed with how you assess those compounds. But I would say where it's going to really affect commercial real estate is old dry cleaner releases that are sitting underneath these old retail centers that are either going to get repurposed for maybe a residential project in urban areas, or are going to get released to a new tenant after the dry cleaner's gone. And to Ron's point, with petroleum, it's less of an inhalation issue with it making a person sick, and it's more of an explosion issue where the petroleum vapors can get into a utility trench and a spark can set off a fire, right? But the vapor intrusion inside a former dry cleaner, those chemicals are toxic. They're pretty aggressive. The chlorinated solvents that are used in dry cleaning can come up through the slab, and the breathing air is in question. And right now we're all trying to figure out what is the problem, because what OSHA allows that dry cleaner worker to inhale while they're dry cleaning is about 100 times, levels 100 times more than what an environmental cleanup site would allow maybe a residential exposure pathway to to be.
Okay, so if I'm testing my building for, say, mold, or I'm testing it for radon, is it going to catch those other vapor intrusion issues?
No, it'll just catch the mold or the radon and won't pick up any chlorinated solvents. But to that point, which is interesting, the mitigation you would perform for, let's say, an old dry cleaner release that we're worried about vapors coming from the slab, you create a sub-slab depressurization system. You pull air from underneath the slab before it enters the working space, right? That would solve a radon issue with a property, right? Because you would be mitigating radon and the chlorinated solvents at the same time.
So now we know when that southern lady was going, oh, vapors, right? that's what she was talking
That's right.
about.
She's just walking out of her dry cleaner.
How many people are testing for radon these days, or does it depend on the area of the country?
I see it a lot. We test often for HUD-funded, federally funded residential multifamily projects, right? So if there's federal dollars being put to work building apartments and senior facilities, we are required to test the property before occupancy and for radon levels above a certain standard that's been established by EPA. But that's where we're seeing it. We're not seeing a whole lot of radon testing in commercial buildings or even I'm trying to high-rise towers. It's really driven by residential.
And how big
development.
is mold in commercial real estate today?
I think mold was supposed to be the new asbestos, and all its consultants geared up, to start, billing hours and time to fixing mold problems. But really, at the end of the day, mold's about being a good landlord.
Yeah.
If you keep your buildings dry and keep the water out, you don't have mold.
Right. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Xceligent, the resource professionals like CCIMs, CBRE, JLL, Colliers, and Bull Realty use for market intelligence. Commercial Search is the site to market and find available properties to buy, sell, or lease all over the country. Visit commercialsearch.com.
Welcome back to the Commercial Real Estate Show. I'm Michael Bull. Thanks for being with us. Today we're talking about environmental strategies where you can save money and make money and avoid the pitfalls of environmental issues. My guests are Robert Bronner, Ron Wallace, and Patrick Putman. And I want to ask you, Patrick, that I'm a borrower. I'm going to buy a building, an office building, or a retail property, what have you, and you're going to do the loan for me. So what are your concerns environmentally, and what are you asking the borrower to really do there?
Well, I would say that the lender and the borrower are on the same side of the table, ensuring that the property value is not impacted by an environmental concern, so that what the lender or what the borrower pays, or the borrower, buyer, and the lender are all using an accurate figure in terms of what the property is really worth.
Yeah, banks have realized they're an investor in the real estate these days.
Absolutely,
After the last
absolutely.
downturn, right? What, we put up 75%, you only put up 25%, right?
So we certainly all want to make sure we're starting at the same number when we split the 75-25s. And then I would say from there, particularly less so on retail properties, but particularly on our industrial users, they want to have a level set, and they want to say, when I bought the property, I was comfortable that it was clean. Some of my manufacturing processes may have the potential to create an environmental concern, and we believe that we've mitigated. The borrower believes they've mitigated those, and so they want to be able to prove that when I bought the property 3 years ago, it was clean. I've run a clean shop since then, and if the problems are discovered, they certainly want to have those before they get in and start their processes.
And I guess, go ahead.
Well, I was thinking, in doing a review of a property, when you're looking at soil and groundwater issues, sometimes it gets overlooked operations, things that a functioning business that would be doing a business loan within their operations that could stop their revenue flow, right? They have a process that gets shut down by the government because it's unsafe, or maybe it's a chemical that's being outlawed. And that's what we call an environmental business risk, not a recognized environmental condition. And that's more something, an issue that could stop the function of the business due to an environmental issue.
Like the guy in the cube coming back from lunch next to me. Right?
There you go. There you go. That guy.
And what about now? If you're going to foreclose on a property, worst case scenario, it's like you're buying the property, right? You're getting a chain of title. So what do you do environmentally there, if anything?
Then we're going back to what's it worth. And so we'll have an appraisal done that gives us a value. We'll have the environmental work done that may detract from that value. And then we do a cost benefit analysis. And does it make sense to continue with the foreclosure process, or are we getting into something that is going to have a cleanup that would far outstrip what we might get from the foreclosure and return of the property? And then we may go a different route on the property guarantors or the borrowers. But again, we just want to make sure that we're not jumping into something that's going to cost more to clean up than the property is worth.
And how many lenders did you see when they were going to foreclose on properties actually coming to you and doing environmental audits?
A lot of them did phase ones when they were going through their foreclosure scenarios where it was really recession driven.
A lot of them, 50%? What's a lot of them?
I think the companies that were buying large tracts of debt that had maybe 80, 100 properties in that tranche, right, were doing phase ones across. They would do a risk analysis, which ones are scary, and we're going to do it on those.
And I get that, and they came to us too for valuations on those properties. But how about the bank when they're just foreclosing on a property? Do you actually see a lot of the banks doing that? Because I think a lot of the stuff we saw was the banks foreclosing a little bit more haphazardly,
right,
and not considering a lot of things like environmental.
A lot of that went on, but it really depended on the REO guy at the bank, whether or not he understood environmental and understood those stories. If he walked up and saw it was a gas station loan, he probably wanted to do some type of testing and run it through Ron's group to see if it was okay. If it was a clean property in the Greenbelt that always been a farmland, they probably didn't spend the money.
Right.
I think
highly unusual for us to take back a commercial property without doing some level of environmental diligence.
Right, or some staged, maybe as opposed to a full bore phase one, maybe Michael, a risk audit, right, to where we look at the database, we do a site visit, or sometimes we could even check an aerial and say, hey, you're probably okay, just from a risk perspective, but no, we're not doing the full phase one for you.
Okay.
And then the bankers would decide whether or not they wanted to spend the money to keep moving forward, or if they were comfortable with that fairly simple kind of risk audit.
Okay. And does a lender that's taken over a property via, say, a deed secured debt and they're foreclosing, do they have the same risk as a buyer buying a property? Or there's some protection of lender liability?
It varies state to state for sure, but some states do have a lender protection where hazardous chemicals, as long as the bank, if they take title to a property and they don't get into the active operation of it, or take decision to do a decision tree and make decisions that could create the problem become worse, right? Then they're afforded a lender protection. But I think that varies state to state.
I agree, but I think certainly there are more protections than there were kind of in the early days of where lenders were fully on the hook for anything they took back, and that's eased up a good bit.
Yes.
Well, if we use Georgia for example, where we're sitting today, might a lender foreclosing a property have some protection environmentally if they didn't know what was going on?
Yes. Through the regulations, because they didn't operate a tank system, through the hazardous waste regs, as long as they don't operate a former chemical plant, that they're just protecting their security interest and then trying to move the title forward. And then you also have the brownfield program, where some lenders have put a property through a brownfield program before they foreclosed and took title, so that they were afforded all those protections as a clean hands purchaser.
So in some cases, might a lender not want to do extensive testing then, so they don't know?
That's a business risk question.
I would say that would be unusual, because
Yeah.
the lender's taking it back. Their intent, we're not in the property owning business. We're going to sell it to somebody else, and the next guy is going to ask those questions. So we want to know the answer.
All right. So if they didn't get in and start operating and managing and operating the property, then maybe they have a little bit of safe haven there.
Yeah, to some degree.
Yeah, we would ask them that actually in the registration, it would still stay in the original owner's name. It would not go in the bank's name typically. But we would ask that obviously the tanks are take all the fuel out and clean it out as much as possible. One thing we encourage the banks to do is to, if there's a Gus Trust Fund, get us all the records so maybe the state can clean it up instead of the bank cleaning it up.
We think that's a great idea.
I think,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, most states have some kind of a trust fund, so this
Yeah.
is something that banks, instead of just foreclosing, take the property, get the records, Show us that they were in the trust fund, that they paid into it, and the state may be able to take it over and clean it up for you.
Okay, well, that's good news if you're a lender. So I had an environmental attorney tell one of my lender clients one time, don't operate the property, don't do a lot of testing. And so I asked him, so what you're saying is you want the lender to say, I did not have relations with that property, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's exactly right.
All right, well, stay tuned. We'll have more on environmental issues. This is the Commercial Real Estate Show. We'll be right back.
The Commercial Real Estate Show is brought to you in part by your friends at Bull Realty. When your business requires proven performance, visit bullrealty.com or call 800-408-BULL.
Welcome back to the Commercial Real Estate Show. I'm Michael Bull. Today we're talking about successful environmental strategies. My guests are Robert Bronner, Ron Wallace, and Patrick Putman. And Patrick, what are some things that, if a buyer's paying all cash for a property, and a lot of buyers are today, unfortunately, sorry about that. But, what are some things, they might not do an environmental while they should. They might not. What are some things that might surprise people about environmental issues?
Well, I would say one thing is they're probably going to have a buyer on the other end, and even if they're a cash buyer, that doesn't necessarily mean when they turn the property that someone else is. The things that concern us, and the reason that we are very focused on environmental diligence, is the prior user or the prior users of the property, as well as the adjacent prior users. So you can look at it today, and here's what it's being used at today. That feels pretty safe. Mm-hmm. But what was it 20 years ago, and what was the guy up the hill 50 years ago? Those are the things that we want to see in the diligence reports.
Yeah. Any other surprises that you've seen people kind of, what? You're kidding me?
We do, well, talking about off-site property owners, we do get phase twos that are adjacent to gas stations, other facilities, and they're sending in suspect releases. We think this gas station or whatever commercial properties had a release, and we do get that. And where the property owner may not have done anything, and all of a sudden now we'll go to the property, the tank owner, and say, you've got a problem that they didn't think they had because they didn't do any due diligence when they bought the property. That could be a real issue.
Right. What are some tips, Robert, for picking your team, picking an environmental person, picking everyone you need to handle this type of process?
Yeah, I think if you're doing environmentally challenged deals, you first need to know the regulatory framework of the region or state you're working in, or even city. Some areas take it down to the county level, how they regulate environmental cleanups. And so you want to know who the players are going to be that are going to give you the green light or the no further action on your deal. And then you want to select a team that's familiar with that process. Again, people that know the story, a lender that's done an industrial rehab into residential, an attorney that's worked a local brownfield program or a brownfield issue in that area you're trying to do your deal in.
Yeah. And is the environmental consultant kind of what you do here in the Southeast? Is that the person that might typically quarterback and help provide those other dream team members?
It can be, a lot of times what will happen if the bigger concerns, it winds up being the environmental attorney will wind up quarterbacking the project. The smaller transactional stuff, maybe the less than $1 million and not large adaptive reuse projects with a lot of working parts, it'll fall back on us, and we'll handle it, start to finish. But again, when you get into a big industrial adaptive reuse project, we typically work underneath the recommendations and guidance of a pretty seasoned environmental attorney.
And that's what the lender's looking for. The lender is even experienced lenders that have been down this path before still want to make sure that the attorney is the environmental attorney is on board, the consultant's on board, the regulators are on board, and that all the parties that have looked at the property are in agreement, and it's worth moving forward on.
Okay,
that's right.
And Ron, what are some sources for listeners and viewers to get more information about environmental issues?
Obviously, the EPA is a good source, but any of the state regulatory agencies, call your state agency if your underground storage tank has waste, whatever program you're dealing with, call and get a contact there. You can actually build, people build a relationship with consultants. I know most of the major consultants that do the underground storage tank in the Atlanta area. So over the years, you do have a relationship and that you can work very comfortably with. You can ask questions, find out the details of the problem.
And would you start with EPA.gov?
EPA.gov is a good one where you can go in there and go to your state, and they'll give you a list of the state regulatory agencies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, thanks for joining us today on Studio One here in Atlanta. We appreciate you being in.
Thank
It was
you.
a pleasure.
Thanks for having us, Michael.
Great. I never knew environmental discussions could be so fun, you know. And I guess anytime you're involving vapor intrusion, right? There's got to be some punchlines, right? Well, and thank you for joining us out there on the 42 radio stations. And be sure and join us next week. We're going to talk about the top 10 issues facing real estate in 2015 and 2016. Until next week, be sure that you always lead, learn, and laugh, and join us for the Commercial Real Estate Show.
The Commercial Real Estate Show is brought to you by Bull Realty, a great place to do business. RealNex, software for productivity. Xceligent, information for the professionals. And Commercial Search, properties for sale and lease. To access these companies or for additional videos, podcasts, and articles, visit CREshow.com.